The rose bush smelled sweet the morning my daughter's letter arrived. No apology, just blame. Still, I trimmed a dead stem with calm hands, the petals brushing my wrist like memory. As the shears clicked, the scent deepened, soft, stubborn, the way forgiveness never was. While the wind carried it across the lot she used to claim, I heard her voice again. That's not your spot. The same dirt she built her pride on now answered to my hands, not her name. That's when I smiled and said, funny. It blooms better without her permission. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The late morning light poured through the oversized windows of the Elkins home, all desert gold and glassy warmth. Patricia Pat Elkins stood at the threshold of the main house, balancing a tray of banana walnut muffins she'd baked at dawn. The smell of cinnamon and browned butter followed her like a polite introduction. She knocked lightly out of habit, though she didn't need to, and heard her granddaughter call, "Come in, Grandma," from the family room. Pat smiled. That voice, bright, unfiltered, 14 going on forever, still made her soften inside. She stepped into the cool air conditioning, her slippers catching on the marble just slightly, a reminder that she was always crossing a line someone else had drawn. Emily sat cross-legged on the couch, papers spread across the coffee table, colored markers, a half-open laptop, and a tangle of enthusiasm. "Can you help me with this?" she asked, eyes hopeful. "It's about Arizona's water rights and stuff. You used to sell properties near the Salt River, right?" Pat set down the tray and lowered herself beside her, careful not to crumble a muffin onto the white couch. "Oh, I remember those," she said, smiling faintly. "Developers always think they can outsmart the desert. The desert always wins." Emily giggled. "That's perfect. Can I quote you?" Pat leaned closer, pointing at the diagram. "Sure, but make sure you explain why. That's the trick." She felt the small warmth of belonging as Emily scooted nearer, their shoulders touching. Then the air shifted. Laura's heels clicked down the hallway, sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that announced before it arrived. "Mom?" Her voice floated tight as a thread. "What are you doing in here?" Pat turned slightly, still smiling. "Just helping Emily with her project." Laura's lips pressed into a smile that wasn't one. She walked to the couch, eyes sweeping across the tray like it was a violation. "I told you to keep snacks in the casita," she said, almost sing-song, then leaned in, lightly, almost playfully, and lifted Pat's hand off the couch arm. "That's not your spot." The words hung in the room, clean and cruel. Emily froze mid-note, the marker trembling. Pat didn't move. For half a second she thought she hadn't heard right, but the warmth drained from her body, replaced by the slow burn of understanding. She looked at her daughter, the sharp lines of her jaw, the practiced confidence, the faint scent of designer perfume, and saw not a stranger, but a woman who had forgotten who taught her to stand tall in the first place. Laura stepped back, smoothing her blouse as though she'd straightened the universe. "You can sit in the breakfast nook," she added, already glancing at her phone. Pat stood. Her movements were small, contained, deliberate, the kind you make when you refuse to let someone see you bleed. "Of course," she said softly. Emily whispered, "Mom." "It's fine, sweetheart," Pat interrupted gently. "Finish your project. You'll do great." She left the tray untouched. Outside, the desert sun hit like honesty. Pat walked the short path to her casita, 24 paces of crushed stone, each one echoing with something she couldn't yet name. Inside, it smelled faintly of lavender cleaner and lemon tea. She closed the door behind her and stood for a long time, letting the silence stretch. Then she crossed to the small closet at the back of her kitchenette and knelt. From behind a row of neat boxes, tax records, family photos, appliance manuals, She pulled out the fireproof chest she hadn't opened in years. Her fingers hesitated on the latch. When she lifted the lid, the paper inside gave off the dry, sweet smell of old ink and permanence. Deeds, receipts, notarized copies, every signature still crisp. Her own name stared up at her from the land contract. Black letters, bold and unbroken. The land. Not the house. The land. Pat exhaled slowly, a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't hurt so much. She sat back on her heels, the room quiet except for the hum of the mini fridge and the faint rattle of the air vent. For the first time in a long while, her heartbeat didn't sound like regret. It sounded like calculation. She closed the box, locked it, and slid it onto the desk beside her. The late light caught on the edge of the paper, making the black ink shimmer. Her phone vibrated. A text from Char, her old friend and broker. "You alive out there, partner?" Pat stared at the screen, her reflection small and steady in the glass. Then she typed back one line. "Need to talk. Tomorrow." She set the phone down beside the contract, the way one sets a match beside dry kindling. And outside, in the still desert air, the wind began to move. By morning, the desert heat was already awake, rising off the stucco walls in shimmers. Pat stood by her casita window with her coffee cooling in her hand, staring toward the main house. From this angle, it looked immaculate. Beige siding, symmetrical landscaping, HOA perfection. But Pat knew what ran under all that beauty. So did Char Webb. Char arrived in her ancient white Lexus, the kind that had outlived 2 marriages and 4 recessions. She stepped out in dark sunglasses and a straw hat big enough to shade her from the truth. "You sounded like someone who just found a ghost in her attic," she said, hoisting her purse. Pat managed a tight smile. "Not a ghost. Just a reminder." Inside, they sat at the narrow breakfast bar. Pat spread the land contract between them, the paper flat and unflinching. The document looked ordinary, typed lines, signatures, seals, but it pulsed with something heavier than ink. Char leaned in, tracing a manicured nail under Pat's name. "You still hold full title," she said after a moment. "Lot number 72, North Ironwood Drive. They built over your dirt, but the dirt's yours?" Pat's throat tightened. "I remember writing that check. Laura was pregnant, and the builder was going to scrap the deal unless we closed that week." "You didn't gift it," Char said, matter of fact. "You financed it." "Which means I never gave it away." Char smiled, a slow, wolfish curl that once closed million-dollar listings. "Exactly." For a while they sat in silence except for the tick of the ceiling fan. The air felt different now. Charged. Alive. Char finally spoke. "If you're serious, I can call someone. Quietly. Someone who specializes in land-only transactions." Pat looked at her friend. "You think I'm serious?" Char's eyebrows rose. "I think you're beyond serious. I think you're about done being polite." Pat almost laughed. It came out like an exhale instead. "Maybe for once." They met later that afternoon at Char's office, a small suite tucked inside a desert plaza between a nail salon and an insurance agency. The blinds were half drawn. The carpet smelled faintly of lemon polish and old ambition. Elijah Tran was already waiting. Char had called him her ace in escrow. He looked young enough to be her son, but carried himself like a man who'd cleaned up plenty of family messes before breakfast. He stood as Pat entered. "Mrs. Elkins, I reviewed your deed. You never executed a gift transfer. That means, legally, the land remains your asset." Pat blinked. "After all these years?" "Land doesn't age," Elijah said simply. "Paperwork does. And yours is immaculate." Pat glanced at Char. "Then I'm ready to reclaim my space. Permanently." Char chuckled, low and admiring. "There's my closer. Elijah nodded approvingly. We'll need to proceed carefully. You can sell the land beneath, but they own the structure. That means any buyer will need to handle a teardown or lease negotiation. Pat considered that. Her daughter's white kitchen, the couch she'd been banished from, the tile she'd chosen back when she still got a say. They'll adapt, she said. They always do. Char opened her laptop and began typing. I'll start a private listing. No MLS. Just investor networks. You'll stay anonymous until we get an offer. Pat ran her fingertips across the cool surface of the counter. It felt like touching a switch she hadn't known existed. By evening, the first ripple of her decision reached her in small ways. A robin landed on the fence outside her casita window, hopping along the iron rail, unbothered by property lines. The sky had gone from orange to deep rose, the air softening. She poured herself a small glass of white wine and sat on the edge of her bed, the land deed open beside her. The edges curled slightly, as if even the paper anticipated change. A knock sounded on her door. 2 light taps. Emily's voice, gentle. Grandma, you left your reading glasses in the kitchen. Pat smiled and opened the door. Emily stood barefoot, her hair messy from homework and late sun. Thank you, sweetheart, Pat said, taking the glasses. Emily hesitated. You okay? Mom said you looked tired. Pat crouched a little so they were eye level. I'm not tired, she said softly. I'm just remembering something important. Emily studied her, uncertain but trusting. Okay. Pat watched her walk back toward the main house. The girl's silhouette framed in the last light. When the door closed, Pat turned back to the deed on the table, her reflection faint in the glass. The name Patricia Elkins seemed to glow. Outside, the cicadas had started their evening chorus, loud and unbothered. Pat whispered to no one in particular. Let's see how they like living on borrowed ground. Char called before sunrise. Check your inbox, partner, she said, her voice brisk, caffeine already in her bloodstream. Drafts live, no names, no noise. Pat opened her laptop. The email subject line read, Soft listing, confidential. Inside was a single paragraph describing the parcel in the most neutral tone imaginable. Prime Scottsdale lot, 42 acres, existing structure not included in sale. Seller holds full land title, free and clear. To anyone else, it was business. To Pat, it was rebellion in 12-point font. She read it twice, then once more. The words glowed against the pale screen, weightless yet irreversible. Her pulse thudded in her wrist. By noon, Char called again. You won't believe this. 3 inquiries already. Investors, developers, even a landscaping firm sniffing around. Everyone loves a teardown in a gated zip. Pat blinked at the desert through her window. The main house shimmered in the heat, still and smug. They don't even know what they're standing on, she murmured. That's the beauty of it, Char said. We'll keep it quiet until we get an offer worth your silence. Pat could hear her clicking through listings, her voice steady, the way it used to sound when they'd chase commissions in their younger days. Only now, the prize wasn't a sale. It was freedom. That afternoon, Elijah stopped by with a manila folder tucked under his arm. He always arrived calm, suit sleeves crisp, expressions measured, every word careful. I wanted to show you the state statute, he said, laying the document on her table. Arizona recognizes what's called a ground lease. You can sell or lease the land beneath, and the structure owner pays fair value or vacates. There's precedent. Pat nodded, scanning the paper. She didn't fully grasp all the citations, but she understood enough. The power was legal, and it was hers. Elijah tapped the last page. If they contest, they'll lose. But I recommend keeping documentation of everything. Emails, statements, even small things. It helps establish motive. Motive. Pat repeated softly. That's one thing I've never lacked. He smiled politely, misunderstanding. I'll keep you updated on interest. When he left, she found herself watching his car disappear down the long drive. A faint shimmer of dust followed behind, golden in the fading light. That evening, Pat took out a spiral notebook, the kind with a cardboard cover and an old real estate logo printed across the front, and began to write. June 11th. Mom, don't track mud on the patio. June 14th. Reed ignores me when I say good morning. June 15th. Laura laughs when I ask about the water bill I pay. The pen moved quickly, her hand steady. She wasn't angry anymore. She was documenting. Each word landed like a nail securing something solid, undeniable. At dinner, she ate alone in her casita. Through her window, she could see shadows moving in the main house. Emily's laughter drifted faintly through the glass, muffled but warm. Later, there was a knock. Pat opened the door to find Emily holding a folder of schoolwork and a grin that didn't match the tension inside the main house. Can I hang out here for a bit? Mom and Dad are arguing about recycling bins again. Pat gestured to the table. Sure. Want tea? Emily shrugged, setting her things down. Grandma, she said after a while, do you ever miss living with someone nice? The question landed with the quiet accuracy only teenagers seem to manage. Pat looked up from her notebook. What makes you ask that? Emily traced a circle on the table with her fingertip. You're always by yourself, but you don't seem lonely. Just done? Pat's lips curved into something between a smile and a sigh. You notice more than they think. Emily met her gaze. That's what Mom says about you. I'm sure she does. They sat in silence for a while, the air heavy but gentle. Outside, the cicadas had started again, the same relentless rhythm that filled every summer night. When Emily left, Pat walked her to the path. From this angle, she could see the house framed in twilight, its lights glowing warm, like a photograph of happiness that had long since faded at the edges. She returned to her desk, added one more line to her logbook. June 17th. Emily asked about kindness. I told her noticing is the start of it. Then she closed the notebook, placed it atop the deed, and whispered, They'll notice soon enough. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the desert dust until the whole yard seemed to breathe. Pat didn't move. She just listened, quietly, deliberately, as the sound carried through the night like an omen. The email came on a Wednesday morning, hidden between HOA newsletters and an ad for patio furniture. Char's subject line was deceptively plain. Offer received. Review ASAP. Pat clicked it open with a steady hand. The PDF was only 2 pages long, but in that brief exchange of numbers and clauses, something irreversible shifted. $247,000. Cash offer. No contingencies. Immediate close. Char's note underneath read simply, Do we move? Pat stared at the figure for a long time. She remembered the down payment she'd written decades ago, the one that saved her daughter's dream home. Funny how life rounded back on itself, the same numbers now spelling something new. Exit. She typed her reply. Yes, quietly. By afternoon, Char's trust company had initiated the paperwork. Everything moved through digital portals, e-signatures, encrypted links, polite confirmation emails. It all felt so sterile compared to what it meant. When Elijah called that evening, his tone was even but charged. Funds will clear in 48 hours. Once they do, I'll deliver the lease termination notice to the occupants. 90 days per state law. The occupants, Pat repeated. She liked how impersonal it sounded. He hesitated. You're certain about proceeding this way? Pat looked out her casita window. The main house glowed with warm lamplight. Inside, silhouettes passed by. Her daughter moving from room to room, controlling every square inch like a general surveying territory. Yes, Pat said. I'm certain. The next morning, her phone buzzed with a bank alert. Incoming wire transfer, $247,000. The number shimmered on the screen, crisp and sterile. For a long time, she didn't touch anything. Then she set the phone down beside her coffee and whispered, "So that's what freedom costs." Char dropped by around lunch, wearing her usual mix of pearls and defiance. "You did it," she said, holding up a manila envelope. "Signed, sealed, funded. My trust company handled escrow. No leaks, no gossip. You're invisible." Pat smiled faintly. "I prefer it that way." They sat together at the small table, the papers between them like a body they'd buried with dignity. "What happens next?" Pat asked. Char took a slow sip of iced tea. "Elijah sends notice. They'll receive a certified letter. 90 days to vacate or negotiate. My guess? They'll scream first, then stall. But the clock's already ticking." Pat folded her hands, fingers steady. "Good." By evening, Elijah had handled everything. The notice was drafted, notarized, and mailed by overnight courier. Every word was coldly legal. Land sale completed. Leasehold termination effective 90 days from receipt. Occupants must vacate or enter new terms with new owner. Pat printed a copy for herself. She didn't frame it. She didn't need to. The next day, Laura found the certified envelope on the doorstep. Pat was watering her small row of succulents when the shouting began. "Mom!" Laura's voice cracked through the dry air, high and disbelieving. "What the hell is this?" Pat turned slowly, hose still in hand. Her daughter stood by the front door in running shorts in anger, the envelope torn open, the letter trembling in her hand. "It's a notice," Pat said evenly. Laura's eyes flared. You sold the land? Our land?" "To who?" "Not our land," Pat corrected. "Mine." Reed appeared behind her, pale, silent, still in his golf shirt. "You can't just sell the ground under our home," he said. Pat tilted her head. "Apparently I can." Elijah confirmed it. Laura's voice shook. "Why would you do this?" Pat set the hose down gently, water hissing onto the gravel. She met her daughter's eyes, steady, calm, no tremor in her voice. "You said it wasn't my spot," she said. "I agree." The silence that followed was brutal, sharp enough to feel physical. Laura stared at her, mouth open, the color draining from her face. You're ruining everything." Pat turned toward her casita. "No," she said softly. "I'm reclaiming it." Inside, the cool air felt heavier than usual. She walked to her printer and retrieved the still warm page, the letter she hadn't framed. The ink smelled faintly metallic, new. She folded it neatly and slipped it into her fireproof box, right on top of the deed. Outside, through her window, she could see Laura pacing the patio, phone pressed to her ear, voice rising into the desert air. Reed stood by the pool, motionless. Pat sat back in her chair and exhaled. Her pulse was steady, her thoughts clear. On her laptop, Char's text appeared. "You okay?" Pat typed back. "Better than I've been in years." Then she added another line to her notebook. "June 22nd. Laura found out." Wind shifted east, finally breathing easier. The air outside stirred again, lifting dry leaves against her window. The world, it seemed, had started moving with her now, and somewhere beyond the gates of their perfect community, a new owner's signature was already inked and waiting. By the time the weekend arrived, the Elkins house no longer felt like a home, more like a stage, the lights still on after the play had ended. Laura spent Friday morning on the phone, pacing barefoot across her kitchen tiles, demanding answers from every attorney she could reach, before noon. "There has to be a loophole," she kept saying, voice tight, breath quick. "You can't just sell the ground under someone's house." But every call ended the same way. with a quiet pause and some variation of, well, technically, she can. That afternoon, Elijah arrived. Not by choice. Laura had requested an explanation, and Pat, with her characteristic calm, agreed to let him meet them all together. Pat waited at the edge of the casita's patio, iced tea in hand, posture measured. She could see through the open kitchen windows. Laura, furious in workout gear. Reed, slouched by the counter like a man pretending composure. When Elijah stepped through the gate, the air felt charged, dry with the kind of tension that makes even the desert hold its breath. Mrs. Elkins. He greeted Pat first, then nodded toward the main house. Shall we? She gestured for him to go ahead. They're expecting you. Inside, the air conditioning hummed hard enough to sound nervous. Laura stood with her arms crossed, the notice letter spread open on the counter beside a stack of highlighted printouts. So, she said sharply, maybe you can explain this insanity to me. Elijah remained perfectly polite. Of course. The documents your mother provided are original and valid. She financed the lot decades ago and retained title. When the home was built, it was classified as a separate improvement, meaning you own the structure, but not the soil it stands on. Laura blinked. That makes no sense. Reed stepped forward. So what? You're telling me our mortgage, our taxes, our home, it's just sitting on borrowed dirt? Elijah's tone didn't waver. Correct. It's uncommon, but legally sound. You own the structure, not the ground beneath it. Laura's laugh came out sharp, nearly hysterical. This is absurd. Reed turned toward Pat, anger edging into something uglier. You'll regret this, he said, jaw tight. We'll sue you for everything you've got. Pat didn't flinch. You'd be suing the woman who built your foundation, literally. Char stepped through the side door just then, sunglasses perched high, tone cool as fresh granite. And you'd lose, she said matter-of-factly. Court would side with the recorded owner, and then you'd pay her court costs too. So maybe save yourself the paperwork. Laura's face flushed crimson. You think this is funny? No, Char said unbothered. I think it's business. You treated it like family until that stopped serving you. She's treating it like what it always was. Property. For a long beat, no one spoke. The hum of the refrigerator filled the silence. Finally, Laura's voice dropped to something fragile. You could have talked to me first, Mom. Pat's eyes softened, but only slightly. You stopped listening a long time ago. I figured I'd save my breath. Reed scoffed, looking at Elijah. You can't expect us to just pack up and go. Elijah glanced between them. You have options. You can negotiate a lease with the new owner or vacate before the 90 days are up. Either way, Mrs. Elkins no longer controls the property. Laura's grip on the counter tightened. So some stranger owns the ground under my kitchen. Pat answered quietly. No stranger, Laura. Just someone who values it. Reed muttered a curse under his breath and stormed outside. The screen door slammed, rattling the frame. Char leaned toward Pat. Want me to stay? Pat shook her head. I'm fine. Go on. Char hesitated, then gave her a knowing nod. Call me if they try anything dumb. When the front door closed behind her, Laura sank into a chair, elbows on the counter. For the first time since childhood, she looked small, unmoored. You really hate me that much? She whispered. Pat studied her daughter, the perfect manicure, the expensive watch, the desperate way she clung to everything that glittered. No, Pat said softly. I just stopped pretending that love means surrender. Laura didn't respond. She just stared past her, eyes unfocused, lips trembling. From the hallway came a soft voice. Mom? Emily stood there, half hidden, her math book still in her hands. How did Grandma do this? Laura exhaled, shaking her head. I don't know, honey. I really don't know. Pat's gaze met her granddaughter's. By remembering everything they forgot, she said. Emily looked between them, uncertain. Something in her expression, a flicker of quiet respect, made Pat's chest ache in the best and worst ways. Outside, Reed's car engine roared to life. Gravel crunched, tires spun. The sound faded down the street until all that remained was the brittle hush of air conditioning and the faint tick of the wall clock. Pat turned toward the door. "I'll be in my casita," she said, calm as if announcing dinner plans. Laura didn't answer. When Pat stepped outside, the desert heat hit her like truth again. Undeniable, cleansing. She closed her eyes and breathed it in. Behind her, through the open window, she could still hear Laura's voice cracking under the weight of disbelief. But the sound was distant now, just another echo of a house built on borrowed ground. Pat walked the short path home, the sun setting low behind the gated walls, each step steady, deliberate. Inside her casita, she poured a glass of wine, opened her notebook, and wrote one line: June 26th. They finally understand what they never owned. She set down the pen, folded her hands, and listened to the cicadas begin again. Relentless, alive, a chorus that belonged only to the desert and to her. Then she smiled, small and certain, as the first stars broke through the darkening sky. By Monday, the neighborhood Facebook group had erupted. Pat wasn't on it. She had learned long ago that peace and Wi-Fi didn't mix, but Char was, and Char texted screenshots. The top post read, "Does anyone know what's going on at the Elkins property? Hearing the mother sold the land?" Unreal, if true. Below it came comments like desert tumbleweeds, quick, dry, multiplying fast. That family always seemed off. Can you even do that legally? Money makes people crazy. Pat scrolled slowly, her thumb steady. She didn't reply. She simply took a screenshot, saved it to her folder labeled Receipts, and closed the app. She'd learned to file evidence the same way she filed her emotions. Privately, neatly, for later. That afternoon, she drove across town to a small law office off Camelback Road. Elijah was already waiting with a folder marked Estate Revision. "Everything's ready," he said, professional but not cold. "The new trust removes your daughter as beneficiary. Your granddaughter remains with deferred access at 25. Pat nodded. "That's fair. She'll be old enough to understand value by then." He passed her a pen. "Sign here, here, and initial there." The pen's glide across paper sounded like something closing softly but completely. When she finished, Elijah slid the papers into a manila envelope and gave a small approving nod. "That's the last of it, Mrs. Elkins. Legally, everything is clean. Emotionally..." He hesitated. "That's harder." Pat gave a faint smile. "Emotions are like property. You can own them without living in them." He looked at her with quiet respect. "I'll file this today and record the transfer of ownership. You'll get confirmation once the county posts it." "Thank you, Elijah." After he left, Pat drove not home, but east, toward the part of Scottsdale where the houses were smaller, friendlier, less curated. There, among the desert willows and citrus trees, she found what she'd been quietly searching for. A single-level townhome with blue shutters, a sun-bleached mailbox, and a porch big enough for 2 rocking chairs. The realtor greeted her at the door. "It's modest," she said apologetically, "but solid bones. Feels warm." Pat stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and possibility. The living room had scuffed wood floors, not tile. The kitchen counters weren't marble. They were laminate, smooth and sincere. "I'll take it," Pat said. That evening, Char came by with champagne and gossip. "You're officially the talk of the HOA," she said, pouring 2 glasses. "Half the board thinks you're a monster. The other half thinks you're a genius. Everyone's picking sides." Pat raised her glass. "That's fine. I've already drawn the line. Char laughed. Damn right you have. They clinked glasses. Outside, a coyote's distant howl threaded through the warm night air, wild and unconcerned with human property lines. Over the next few days, movers arrived at her casita. Pat supervised without sentimentality, just boxes, labels, and quiet efficiency. Every piece she kept had a purpose. Every piece she left behind had a lesson. The neighbors stared from their driveways, whispering over mailboxes. One woman from the HOA even stopped by with forced cheer. "We just hope everything works out for your family, dear," she said, clutching her clipboard like a shield. Pat smiled sweetly. "Everything already has." That night, she sat alone in her new living room, surrounded by unpacked boxes and the faint echo of her own breathing. For the first time in months, she didn't hear anyone else's footsteps above her. No voices arguing through walls. Just her space, her air, her ground. Her phone buzzed, a message from Elijah. Filed today, public notice recorded, ownership transfer complete. Below it was a scanned confirmation, the county seal, the lot number, her signature no longer the owner of borrowed land, but the author of its ending. Pat stared at the document for a long time, then closed her laptop and leaned back. The desert night pressed gently against the windows, warm and forgiving. She thought briefly of Laura, of the silence that must be settling over that house now, the fragile kind that comes after realization. Then she opened her notebook and wrote, slowly, deliberately, July 2nd. Public record posted. Noise around me fading. Peace beginning. She set the pen down, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a moment, listening. Somewhere outside, sprinklers hissed to life, watering soil that no longer carried her name. It made her smile. Because peace, she realized, didn't need to be seen or shared. It just needed to be owned. The invitation came in the mail, addressed in Emily's careful handwriting. It wasn't fancy. Just a folded program from Desert Vista Middle School's spring play, A Midsummer Night's Dream, with a sticky note attached. Please come, Grandma. I saved you a seat. Pat held the note a long time, tracing the ink as if it were a small hand she could still hold. She almost didn't go. Almost. But on Thursday evening, she pulled on a soft blue cardigan, the same color as the shutters on her new townhome, and drove back toward the neighborhood she used to call hers. The auditorium's parking lot was full, rows of SUVs and hybrids gleaming beneath floodlights. She parked near the far edge, away from the chatter of parents in HOA polos and floral blouses. Her heartbeat felt too loud, as though it hadn't yet learned how to be casual in this place again. Inside, the lobby buzzed with fluorescent brightness and the sticky scent of school concessions, soda, candy, hairspray. She found Emily's name printed in the program. Fairy Ensemble, Emily Elkins. The letters looked proud, unbothered by the family name they carried. Pat took her seat halfway back, an aisle spot, holding the program in both hands. It trembled slightly, not from age, but from what it meant to sit here, visible and unwelcome. A few rows ahead, Laura and Reed were already seated. Laura's hair was perfect, her posture knife-straight. She turned once, saw Pat, and froze. No wave, no acknowledgement. Just a quick turn of the head and a whisper to Reed. Pat caught the motion of his lips. She's not welcome here. It didn't sting. Not anymore. It just clarified the air around her, like the desert after rain. Harsh, clean, necessary. The lights dimmed. The curtain rose. When Emily stepped on stage, wings slightly crooked, cheeks flushed under stage lights, Pat felt something in her chest unclench. Emily spotted her halfway through her lines, her expression breaking briefly into a beam of pure, unfiltered joy. That look alone was worth every signed document and sleepless night. For the next 40 minutes, Pat watched every moment like it was oxygen. The music cues, the nervous laughter, the way Emily found her footing after tripping on a prop, and turned the stumble into a graceful spin that made the audience laugh with her, not at her. When the play ended, applause filled the room like wind through dry leaves. Pat clapped softly, smiling, letting the moment belong to everyone else. She didn't need credit. She'd learned the power of quiet ownership. After the show, parents crowded the aisles, cameras flashing, hugs exchanged like currency. Pat waited, patient and still, holding her folded program against her chest like a small trophy for endurance. She saw Laura guiding Emily through a swarm of classmates, Reed trailing behind, distractedly checking his phone. When Emily spotted her again, she broke free, sprinting across the lobby with a wide grin. "Grandma!" Pat opened her arms just in time. Emily collided into her, breathless, laughing. The scent of stage makeup and cotton candy shampoo filled the space between them. "You were amazing," Pat said softly. Emily's eyes shone. "I saw you. You came." "Of course I did. You asked." From across the room, Laura watched, stiff and unreadable. Her arms were folded, her mouth a thin line. Reed leaned in to whisper something, but Laura shook her head. She didn't come closer. Emily looked up, unaware of the cold stares behind her. "I wish you lived with me again," she said, voice breaking on the last word. Pat brushed a curl from her granddaughter's forehead. "You will," she said gently. "One day. In a way they can't touch." Emily frowned a little, confused but trusting. "Promise?" Pat smiled, small and steady. "Already kept." The crowd thinned. The custodians began stacking chairs. Laura approached halfway, hesitated, then turned back toward the exit. Pat didn't chase her. She'd stopped chasing long ago. She walked Emily to the doors, her hand resting lightly on the girl's shoulder. Outside, the air was soft, the kind of Arizona night that felt both empty and infinite. They stood beneath the glow of parking lot lights, saying nothing for a moment. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote cried out again. Same lonely note, same wild freedom. Emily squeezed her hand once before running to catch up with her parents. Pat watched until the taillights of their SUV disappeared beyond the gate. Then she unfolded the program, pressed Emily's name once with her thumb, and tucked it carefully into her purse. Back in her car, she turned the key and sat there as the engine hummed to life. In the rearview mirror, the school lights blurred in her eyes like a constellation that didn't quite belong to the sky. She smiled, faint but real, because Emily's words weren't a wish. They were a timeline. And time, Pat thought, was on her side now. It was a Monday morning in late August when the moving trucks came. Two of them, white, impersonal, stamped with a rental company logo, rolled through the gates of Ironwood Drive at precisely 8:05 a.m. Pat watched from the driver's seat of her own car, parked discreetly beneath a Palo Verde tree across the street. The air was already heating, the sky the pale, merciless blue that only Arizona knew how to make. Laura stood on the front porch, arms crossed, her hair pulled into a messy bun that didn't suit her. She looked smaller without control, without that edge of authority she'd once carried through every room. Reed paced beside her, phone glued to his ear, gesturing toward the movers like a man trying to hold together something that had already come undone. Boxes came first, then furniture, then the framed art that used to hang in the foyer, the one Pat had given them as a housewarming gift years ago. She watched as one mover tilted it sideways through the door, its glass catching a hard glint of sunlight before vanishing into the truck's hollow space. Pat didn't wave. She just sat still, window cracked, listening to the dull rhythm of packing tape and muffled orders. Char's car pulled up beside hers with the subtlety of someone who enjoyed being noticed anyway. The window rolled down. "They're almost done," she said, squinting through her sunglasses. Heard from the HOA president that they're moving to a rental over in Tempe. Not quite the same view. Pat's eyes stayed on the house. Nothing ever is. For a while, they said nothing, just watched. The sound of a life being dismantled wasn't loud. It was quiet, systematic. Finally, Char asked, "You want to keep the structure?" Pat's voice was soft, but certain. "Tear it down. Plant something instead." Char gave a low whistle. "You don't do half measures, do you?" "I used to," Pat said. "They called it grace." Char smiled faintly, shaking her head. "You're something else, Pat." When the last truck door slammed shut, Laura turned one final time to look at the house. Her expression wasn't angry anymore. It was hollow, a woman searching for meaning in walls that no longer recognized her. Pat almost pitied her. Almost. Laura climbed into the SUV. Reed followed. They didn't notice Pat's car across the street. When the engine started, the sound reverberated through the still air. The SUV rolled forward, slow at first, then gathered speed. Pat's eyes followed until the vehicle disappeared through the gated exit, sunlight flaring briefly off the windshield before it vanished down the road. Char exhaled, long and low. And just like that, they're gone. Pat nodded. Her fingers rested on the steering wheel, steady, unshaking. Good. Later that afternoon, the demolition crew arrived. Contracts had been signed weeks earlier, quietly, through Char's network. No fanfare, no announcement. By sunset, the rumble of machinery filled the air. Pat stood on the edge of the lot, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face, watching as the excavator's arm swung forward and bit into the roof line. The house shuddered, groaned, then began to fold in on itself, a slow, deliberate undoing. It wasn't violent, it was surgical. Tile cracked, drywall split, glass shattered into harmless glitter on the dirt below. Dust lifted in thin spirals, golden in the evening light. Char stood beside her, arms crossed. "You sure you don't want to rebuild? Could turn this into a fortune." Pat smiled slightly. Money was never the problem. The foreman approached, hard hat in hand. "Ma'am, we can clear it all by Friday. What do you want done after that?" Pat glanced at the emptying lot, the desert beginning to breathe again under the wreckage. "Wildflowers," she said. "Native ones. Nothing that needs watering." He nodded. "Easy enough." When the crew left, silence filled the air again, the kind of silence that isn't absence but arrival. Pat stepped onto what had once been the living room. Beneath her feet, the soil felt loose, warm, alive. She crouched, scooped up a handful, let it run through her fingers. It left faint, dusty trails down her wrist, light, free. A small wind rose, brushing her hair back. Somewhere far off, a bird called, clear and solitary. From behind her, Char's voice broke the quiet. "The new buyer asked if you'd consider listing again once it's cleared." Pat turned, her smile soft but unyielding. "Not yet." Char tilted her head. "Waiting for something?" Pat looked back at the land. Bare, open, honest. "No," she said, just letting it breathe. The sun slipped lower, throwing long, amber lines across the ground where walls used to stand. She stood there until the last shadow faded, until even the dust settled. And when she finally turned to leave, she didn't look back, because there was nothing left to reclaim, only everything left to grow. By September, the lot had transformed. What had once been the Elkins house was now an open stretch of pale earth and scattered stones, sun-warmed and breathing again. No fences, no footprints, just possibility. Pat visited every morning with her thermos of tea and her wide-brimmed hat, walking the perimeter like she was reacquainting herself with something sacred. It was during one of those walks that she spotted it, a small, Smooth rock, half buried in the dust near where the living room used to be. The color caught her eye, a swirl of muted rose and gray, marbled like storm clouds caught in stone. She crouched, brushed the dirt off with her thumb, and turned it in her palm. It fit perfectly, like something waiting to be held again. She smiled to herself. "Guess you made it through," she murmured. The rock wasn't special, not to anyone else, but to Pat, it was proof that something could survive collapse, quietly, stubbornly. She slipped it into her pocket. Later at home, she placed it on her desk beside the lamp and the notebook she'd been filling since this began. That night, she opened the trust documents Elijah had sent and began drafting a new clause in her own neat handwriting. Upon my passing, full ownership of Lot 72, North Ironwood Drive, and all future improvements shall transfer to my granddaughter Emily Elkins to be released at age 25. No exceptions, no early access. She read it twice, then slid it into a folder labeled Final Intentions. The next morning, Char stopped by, wearing a linen blazer despite the heat. She poured herself coffee before Pat could offer, moving with the ease of someone who'd stopped asking permission years ago. "You're quiet today," Char said. "That's never a good sign with you." Pat smiled faintly. "Not quiet. Just settled." Char tilted her head. "That sounds ominous." Pat handed her the folder. "I added something." Char opened it, scanned the page. "Giving the land to Emily." She paused, meeting Pat's eyes. "You sure? That's a big decision." Pat nodded. "She's the only one who saw me, not just the role I played." Char set down the folder carefully, almost reverently. "Then let's make it official." At the attorney's office later that afternoon, the light from the window fell across the table like an underline. Elijah read the revised clause aloud, his voice measured but approving. "This solidifies everything, clean and airtight. Upon transfer, Emily will be the sole owner, free and clear." Char signed as witness, her pen moving with authority. There, history made. Elijah handed the final page to Pat. "All legal, all final." She signed slowly, her cursive looping steady and graceful. When she finished, she exhaled through her nose, the faintest sound of relief, almost like forgiveness. As they packed up, Elijah lingered by the doorway. "You've done something rare, Mrs. Elkins. Most people chase control. You built closure." Pat smiled. "It's the only thing worth keeping." That evening, she wrote the letter. It wasn't long, just a single page of truth written in her even, elegant handwriting. "My darling Emily, I gave them comfort. They gave me contempt. You gave me back worth. This land is yours when you're ready. Not because you need it, but because you'll know what not to give away. Love, Grandma Pat." She folded it carefully, tucked it into an envelope marked for Emily, open at 25, and placed it inside her fireproof box beside the deed and her notebook. The rock she'd found sat on the lid, catching the lamplight like a quiet witness. A week later, she returned to the empty lot one last time before the landscapers arrived. The morning was cool, the desert sky rinsed clean after a rare storm. The air smelled faintly of creosote and new beginnings. Pat sat on the edge of what had once been the driveway, thermos balanced on her knee. She poured herself tea, steam curling upward into the sunlight. The wildflowers had already begun to sprout, tiny bursts of yellow and white pushing through the sand where walls used to cast shadows. She took a slow sip, her reflection flickering on the metal rim. Behind her, a car slowed at the curb, someone from the HOA maybe, or a curious neighbor trying to match rumor with reality. Pat didn't turn. She just smiled into her tea. The land hummed beneath her feet, open and unclaimed. For the first time, it felt like peace didn't just belong to her. It was her. She looked out across the soil, light washing over everything that had once been broken, and whispered, "You'll know what to do with it, sweetheart." Then she stood, brushed the dust from her hands, and left the rock where she'd been sitting, another marker of where something real had once been. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the wildflowers, across the bare earth, across the single teacup cooling on the ground. Pat walked away slowly, each step lighter than the one before. Because revenge, she realized, was never about taking back what was hers. It was about giving back what should last. The letter came from Laura 3 weeks after the trust was finalized. It wasn't handwritten, of course. Laura didn't do ink anymore. It was a printed note, short, polite, and stripped of warmth. "I don't know why you hate me this much. Whatever satisfaction you got from this, I hope it was worth it. Emily doesn't need your bitterness. No signature, just Laura." Pat read it once at her kitchen table, the morning light falling clean and sharp across the page. Then she folded it neatly and placed it inside the drawer where she kept appliance manuals, things she'd never need again but refused to throw away. She didn't draft a reply. She simply pulled out a single sheet of stationery, wrote Laura at the top, and beneath it, in steady pen strokes, copied the words her daughter had once said without thinking. "That's not your spot." She didn't sign that either. She slipped it into an envelope and mailed it certified. The following week, she bought a rose bush. At the nursery, the clerk asked, "You want annuals or perennials?" "Perennial," Pat said, running her hand over a bloom the color of soft rust. "Something that stays even when you don't." When she carried it to her car, dirt spilled onto the seat, scattering like freckles of memory. The next morning, she drove to the empty lot. The landscapers had finished days ago. The wildflowers had begun to spread, curling in loose waves across the open ground. In the center, she planted the rose bush. The soil gave easily under her spade. When she finished, she knelt for a moment beside it, gloved hands pressing the earth smooth. The sun was bright, the sky wide and rinsed of everything heavy. "This is where it starts," she said quietly to herself. Later that afternoon, Emily came by. Her mother didn't know. Pat suspected as much. The girl had ridden her bike, dust coating her sneakers, a backpack bouncing behind her. "Grandma," she called, coasting to a stop by the curb. "Mom said this place is just dirt now." Pat smiled. "Not just dirt. Come see." Emily followed her through the open gate, pushing her hair from her face. When she saw the rose bush, she stopped. "It's pretty," she said. "Is this where your house was?" Pat brushed soil from her gloves, looked around the wide, wild field of yellow and white. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "It's where my silence used to be." Emily frowned, not quite understanding, but something in the tone made her quiet. She crouched beside the rose bush and touched one of the petals gently. "It smells nice." "It does," Pat agreed. "Some things do when you stop letting people trample them." Emily stood again, brushing her knees. "Mom said you're never coming back." Pat turned toward her, the sun catching her silver hair. "I don't need to," she said. "Some places are finished, others just start over." Emily nodded, even if she didn't grasp the full meaning. Children always understood emotion before logic. That was enough. "Can I visit again?" Emily asked. "Whenever you want," Pat said. "It'll be here waiting." They walked the lot together, the dry grass brushing against their ankles. Pat felt the quiet between them stretch and settle into something almost tender. When Emily finally rode off, her bike wobbling as she turned down the street, Pat stayed behind. She poured water from her thermos onto the rose bush, careful not to drown it. A single petal floated loose and landed in the dirt, red against gold. Char arrived a few minutes later, wearing jeans and sunglasses too glamorous for gardening. She stood at the edge of the lot, one hand on her hip. "Well, I'll be damned. You actually planted something. Pat glanced over. Every ending deserves a marker. Char nodded toward the rose bush. You thinking of building something here eventually? Pat looked out at the land, the wide sky, the wind rippling through flowers, the quiet hum of insects returning to claim it. Maybe someday, she said. But not for me. Char raised a brow. For Emily? Pat smiled faintly. For whoever remembers what this was supposed to mean. They stood there together, two old friends framed by sunlight and silence. The breeze carried the faint scent of rose and soil, the kind that only came from something newly alive. Char slipped her hands into her pockets. You know, she said, I think you might have broken them. Pat shook her head. No, she said quietly. I just stopped breaking myself. Char studied her for a long moment. You really are done, aren't you? Pat's gaze drifted back to the rose bush, its stem trembling in the wind but holding firm. I'm not done, she said finally. I'm planted. A beat of silence hung between them before Char smiled, slow and genuine. That's one way to end a war. Pat didn't answer. She just stood in the middle of the lot as the desert wind picked up, carrying petals across the ground like small red confessions. The bush bent, but didn't break. Neither did she. The first sentence came to her in the middle of the night. Pat sat up in bed, reached for the notebook on her nightstand, and wrote, This isn't a story about land. It's about space. What's given, what's taken, and what you choose to reclaim. When the words stopped trembling on the page, she set the pen down and smiled in the dark. By morning, the idea had shape. She brewed her coffee, opened her laptop, and created a blank document titled Not My Spot. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat. She began with the couch, the tray of muffins, her daughter's hand lifting hers from the armrest. The silence that followed. Every chapter after that unfolded like an architectural drawing. Lines, angles, boundaries. Not bitterness, not even revenge, just the truth, rendered clean. Each section read more like a ledger than a confession. Receipts scanned in chronological order, photos of the original deed, screenshots of text threads and bank confirmations, each one labeled and dated with meticulous precision. At first, she thought she was building a defense. Then she realized she was writing a manual, her own blueprint for how to survive being erased. When she finished, 3 weeks had passed. She printed the document, hole-punched the pages, and placed them in a navy binder. The title page read, Not My Spot, a personal record by Patricia Elkins. No dedication, no apology. She flipped through the pages one last time, nodding slightly, like a builder inspecting the final beam before signing off. Then she slid the binder into her fire-safe box, alongside the letter for Emily and the land deed. On a white label, she wrote, For Emily, when the world tells you to move. The next day, she called Elijah. I'm making my trust irrevocable, she said simply. There was a pause on the other end. You're sure? Absolutely. It's time to make the blueprint permanent. That afternoon, they met at his office. The blinds were open, sunlight slanting across stacks of legal folders. Char was already there, pen in hand, ready to notarize. This is it, Char said. No undo button after today. Pat chuckled softly. Good. I've had enough undoing. Elijah slid the papers across the desk, his tone gentle but ceremonial. Once you sign here, every asset clause and designation becomes fixed. The trust becomes law. Pat read through each line carefully. She didn't rush. She'd spent her life selling property. Now she was securing legacy. At the bottom of the final page, she wrote her name in slow, deliberate strokes. Patricia L. Elkins. Char stamped the notary seal with a decisive thunk. the circular emblem pressing into the paper like permanence itself. Elijah gathered the pages, tapping them into alignment. "It's done," he said. "This can't be challenged or revoked. Your blueprint holds." Pat leaned back, a small, weary smile pulling at her mouth. That's all I wanted, to know it wouldn't be redrawn. When she stepped outside, the heat met her like a handshake. Dry, honest, grounding. Char followed her into the parking lot. "You really think Emily will understand all this someday?" Pat looked up at the clear sky, sunlight glinting off the hood of her car. "She doesn't have to understand it," she said. "She just has to inherit the quiet." Char grinned, pushing her sunglasses up. "You and your poetic justice." "Justice is overrated," Pat said, unlocking her car. "I prefer design." Later that evening, Pat took a slow walk through her new neighborhood. The sidewalks still smelled of warm concrete. Sprinklers ticked in rhythmic arcs across front yards. A boy on a scooter zipped past her, calling to someone she couldn't see. She passed tidy mailboxes lined in a row. Anderson, Flores, Kim, and then hers. Elkins, black letters sharp against brushed silver. Her name, her ground. No shared deed, no conditional kindness. She reached out and traced the letters with her fingertip, the metal still warm from the day. For a long moment she just stood there, breathing in the quiet suburban air, unremarkable to anyone else, but to her, pure oxygen. A single moth circled the streetlight above her, drawn to a glow it didn't understand but trusted anyway. Pat smiled. "Same, sweetheart," she murmured. Back inside, she placed the rock from the lot on her new mantle, her silent witness to everything. It gleamed faintly under lamplight, solid and sure. She poured herself a cup of tea, sat at her kitchen table, and watched the light shift across the room. Everything that mattered was recorded, sealed, and waiting. For the first time, she wasn't planning her next move. She was living in it. But as the night deepened and the air turned cool, she found herself glancing once toward the window, toward the horizon, where the desert began again. Something in her chest flickered. Not regret, but readiness. Because even blueprints she knew were meant to be built upon. Offers came in like clockwork. Developers, investors, even one man from a luxury landscaping company who claimed he could transform legacy into liquidity. Pat deleted every email without reading the attachments. She didn't want square footage or renderings. She wanted space. Untouched. Honest. Breathing. The land on Ironwood Drive belonged to no one's ambition anymore. And for the first time, it was beautiful because of it. When Char stopped by with her laptop and a grin that meant mischief, Pat was already expecting it. "You're ignoring offers again," Char said, setting the computer on the table. "Do you know what they're offering now? $500,000? Cash. You could buy a second home in Sedona." Pat stirred her tea, unbothered. "I already have 2 homes, Char. One with walls and one with roots." Char sighed but smiled. "You're impossible." "I'm consistent," Pat said. A week later, Pat hired a landscaper named Owen. Quiet man, mid-30s, tan from work, and polite enough not to pry. They met early in the morning on the edge of the lot. She explained what she wanted in short sentences. No fences, no paths, just wildflowers, desert marigolds, brittlebush, penstemon. "I want color that doesn't apologize for being here." He nodded. "That's easy enough. You want a sitting spot? Shade?" Pat paused, then smiled faintly. "A bench. Stone. Simple." When the job was finished, the lot didn't look landscaped. It looked returned. Waves of yellow and violet bloomed across the soft dirt, bending under the wind, but never breaking. In the center stood the bench, carved from smooth granite, facing east where the morning light hit first. A small bronze plaque gleamed along its edge. Still here, no names, no dates, just presence. When she visited for the first time after it was finished, Pat sat down and let her hands rest on the cool stone. The breeze carried the smell of dust and faint sweetness from the marigolds. The silence wasn't lonely. It was earned. She stayed until the horizon blushed orange and the streetlights blinked on one by one. Then she whispered, "You did good, ground. You remembered how to breathe." From then on, Emily came every other Sunday. She'd bring sketchbooks, water bottles, sometimes her homework. She'd sit cross-legged beside the bench while Pat watched from the shade of a sun hat. The girls' drawings had changed lately. Less people, more open spaces. One afternoon, Emily pointed at the plaque. "Why does it say 'still here'?" Pat smiled. "Because some things deserve to stay, even when no one thinks they should." Emily nodded, satisfied. "It's like stubborn hope." "That's a better name for it," Pat said. They watched a jackrabbit dart between the flowers. Emily sketched it quickly, lines soft but sure. As the years tilted forward, the ritual became their rhythm. Tea for Pat, drawing for Emily, quiet for both. Laura never joined. Once, just once, Pat saw her. She was driving past, slowing just enough to glance at the lot. The SUV window was tinted, but Pat recognized the shape of her posture, that familiar stiffness. Laura didn't stop, didn't roll down the window. She just stared for a heartbeat too long, then drove on. Pat didn't wave. She didn't feel bitterness either. Just an odd, steady peace. Like watching weather pass through without needing to predict the storm. Later, when Char came to visit, she stood beside the bench, hands on her hips. "You really did it," she said. "You kept it empty." Pat smiled, eyes tracing the horizon. "It's not empty. It's full of everything that finally got to breathe." Char squinted, reading the plaque. "Still here, huh?" Pat nodded. "It's what's left when everything else is gone." Char turned toward her, voice low. "You know, Pat, you kept the quiet. That's the real revenge." Pat laughed softly, the sound carried off by the wind. "I didn't keep it," she said. "I earned it." They stood together as the sun dipped low, turning the wildflowers to gold. When Char left, Pat lingered. The light shifted, the air cooling into that perfect desert stillness that meant the day had decided to rest. She sat on the bench again, the stone familiar against her palms, and whispered to the earth beneath her feet. "Still here." The words echoed faintly between the hills. Small, certain, unshakable. And for the first time, the land didn't just listen, it answered. A wind stirred the flowers, bending them toward her, bowing as if in acknowledgement. Pat closed her eyes and smiled, the sound of it blending with the hush of the soil that would outlive them all. It started, as most endings do, with a form. Pat sat at her kitchen table, morning sunlight pooling across the papers Elijah had left in a neat, silent stack. The top sheet read, "Quit claim, release of residual rights." It wasn't dramatic, not even complicated. Just a signature that would untangle the last thin thread of her daughter's name from the land records. An administrative ghost of ownership no one but Elijah had noticed. Pat ran her thumb across the embossed county seal, then reached for her pen. The weight of it felt familiar. Grounding. "Last loose nail," she murmured and signed. The ink dried quickly. She let it. Elijah arrived that afternoon to collect the packet. He always parked perfectly straight in the driveway, like order itself had chosen to drive a Lexus. "You're sure?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "I'm sure," Pat said. "It's time to clean the bones." He nodded once, placing the documents carefully in his briefcase. "This will record within 72 hours. After that, no one named Elkins, except you, will exist on the property history. Pat smiled faintly. Good. I'd hate for the county to confuse memory with ownership. When Elijah left, the silence settled again, the kind that meant things were finished. That evening, she took one final step. The old house number, the brass numerals that once hung beside the front door, had been sitting in her desk drawer for months, their edges dulled by dust. She wiped them clean, wrapped them in brown paper, and mailed the package to Habitat for Humanity with a short note. Let these belong to someone who still believes home means kindness. It wasn't an act of sentiment, it was release. 2 days later, Char showed up unannounced, as usual, leaning against the doorway with that half grin that meant she'd already heard the gossip. Word around the HOA is that you finally scrubbed their names off everything, even the lot registry. Pat poured her friend coffee, the rich smell filling the kitchen. I did. Char raised her mug like a toast. Then that's that. No one will even remember they were here. Pat's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. I will, she said quietly, but only to avoid becoming them. Char watched her for a long beat, then nodded. That's the difference, isn't it? You remember without repeating. Pat gave a small shrug. History deserves witnesses, not tenants. That Sunday, Emily came to visit. The wildflowers were taller now, waist-high in places, rustling like applause in the wind. Pat brought lemonade. Emily brought a small leather journal, its cover sun-bleached and soft. Grandma, Emily said, sitting cross-legged by the bench. Can I leave this here? It's just sketches and stuff. But I kind of want this to be my spot, too. Pat smiled. Your spot's already waiting, sweetheart. But you can still leave a piece of it behind. Emily grinned and set the journal on the stone bench, carefully centered beneath the plaque. The breeze lifted a few of its pages, revealing looping handwriting and pencil drawings, wildflowers, the bench, the words, still here written in bold strokes across one page. When she left later that afternoon, Pat lingered. The journal stayed behind, edges fluttering like something alive. As twilight deepened, she picked it up gently, brushing off a layer of dust. She flipped to the last page. Emily had written one line in neat, deliberate script. This is my safe place. Pat closed the journal and held it to her chest for a moment. The air smelled faintly of roses and warm stone. Back home, she opened the fireproof box, her quiet archive of everything that mattered, and placed the journal inside, on top of the binder labeled, Not My Spot. For a long moment she stared at the collection, the deeds, the trust papers, the letters, the rock, artifacts of a war fought without shouting. She ran her fingers over the journal's cover, then shut the lid and locked it with a click that sounded like finality. Outside, the night pressed against the windows, vast and dark and humming with the sound of distant wind. Pat sat by the window, tea cooling in her hands, watching as the moonlight spilled across the edges of her small living room. Everything was where it should be. Everyone, too. But still, something flickered, a quiet, patient awareness that the story wasn't finished. Because she hadn't meant to build a monument. She'd built an inheritance. And now, somewhere in the dark, that inheritance was already waking up. Breathing, remembering, waiting for the next set of hands brave enough to hold it. The wildflowers were higher than her knees now, pale gold and silver green in the morning light. The desert had kept its promise. It bloomed again, quietly, without asking permission. Pat slipped off her shoes at the edge of the lot and stepped onto the cool soil. The ground felt soft, still damp from the previous night's irrigation. She moved slowly, bare feet pressing delicate crescents into the earth, careful not to crush the petals brushing against her ankles. She hadn't walked barefoot outside in years. The sensation startled her, the texture, the temperature, the realness of it. For a moment she closed her eyes, listening. Wind in the brittle bush. A distant bird. Somewhere, the faint hum of suburban sprinklers. All of it stitched together into a kind of music that didn't need words. She reached the bench and sat, brushing dust from her calf. The bronze plaque caught the sunlight again. Still here. Its letters softened by time but unyielding. She smiled. The land was aging with her. That afternoon she updated her final instructions. Elijah had sent her a new packet last week, asking about medical directives and estate preferences. She filled out every line neatly in blue ink. No service, no speeches, no slideshow, cremation preferred. Scatter ashes at Ironwood Lot 72. Deliver letter to Emily Elkins upon my passing. No one else needs a copy. She placed the completed forms in the same fireproof box, sealing it with the same quiet ritual she'd practiced for years. Then she took out a fresh envelope, her handwriting slow but deliberate. My dearest Emily, when the noise of the world grows too loud, find the quiet spot that reminds you who you are. That's where I'll be. Don't mourn me. Just keep noticing the things that stay alive when no one's looking. All my love, Grandma Pat. She folded the letter, slipped it into a smaller envelope labeled, "For when the dust settles," and tucked it into the box beside Emily's journal. The following morning, Shar arrived with a tin of freshly baked scones and a grin that could still outshine most desert mornings. "You've been hiding again," she teased, placing the tin on the bench. "I figured this spot needed a little butter and gossip." Pat laughed softly. "Both are always welcome." They sat together under the same patch of sunlight, steam rising from their cups of tea. Around them, the wildflowers bent with the wind, creating waves of color across the open ground. Char broke a scone in half, butter melting instantly. "You realize, of course, this place has become legend? Everyone in the HOA whispers about the mysterious old lot that refuses to sell." Pat smirked. "Good. Let them make up their own ending." Char studied her friend for a moment. "You really are content, aren't you?" Pat looked out over the expanse of yellow blooms, the stone bench, the horizon she'd learned by heart. "This is the spot I saved," she said quietly. "Every inch of peace they didn't think I deserved." For once, Char didn't have a clever reply. She just nodded, took another bite of her scone, and smiled. That afternoon, Emily came alone. Char had already left, promising to return with fresh lemon curd next week. The teenager, no, young woman now, was taller. Her hair sun-streaked, her confidence quieter but deeper. She carried a small sketchbook, its edges frayed from use. "Grandma," she said, sitting beside her on the bench. "I started drawing houses again. Not like Mom's, though. Smaller ones. Ones that fit people instead of swallowing them." Pat chuckled. "That sounds like good architecture." Emily turned toward her, earnest. "I want to live like you." Pat's gaze softened. "Then remember where you came from," she said. "And what not to accept." Emily didn't answer right away. She just leaned her head gently against Pat's shoulder. The smell of wildflowers and dust hung between them. "I think I already do," she whispered. They sat there in silence as the light began to fade. The sky turned the color of old photographs, peach and lavender, memories pressed against the horizon. Pat glanced down at her feet, bare again, dust gathering between her toes. The earth was warm now, breathing steady beneath her. She thought of how strange it was, that peace could bloom in the very soil that once held her humiliation. That silence could grow louder than anger if you tended it long enough. Emily broke the stillness with a small laugh. "Do you think it'll always look like this?" Pat smiled faintly. "Nothing ever stays the same, but the good things know how to come back." When Emily left, Pat stayed until the stars began to show. She traced the air above the bench with her fingertip, as if outlining a memory. The couch she'd been banished from, the words she'd swallowed, the roots she'd planted. Now there was only the hum of crickets, the perfume of desert blossoms, and the soft, persistent truth of the land she'd kept. Pat stood, brushing the dust from her hands, and looked up at the sky. The silence they'd left her wasn't emptiness anymore. It was inheritance, and it was finally enough. The morning light arrived in slow gold, weaving through the wildflowers that covered the lot like a quilt. Pat sat on the stone bench, her thermos balanced beside her, steam curling up in lazy ribbons. The air smelled faintly of sage and soil after a rare desert drizzle the night before. Her feet rested bare on the earth, the soles dusted with pale grit. She liked feeling the ground, her ground, underneath her, cool and real. The bench plaque glimmered in the sunlight. Still here. Next to her sat Emily's newest drawing, a watercolor this time, soft washes of ochre and violet, the bench at the center, and Pat herself, sketched small but solid, a single figure framed by wild flowers. Across the top, in Emily's neat looping handwriting, she'd written, "Grandma's ground." Pat smiled at it, tracing the letters gently with one finger. Emily's work had grown more precise, more confident. Each brush stroke was alive, as if the desert itself had lent her its patience. She lifted her thermos, took a slow sip of tea, and watched a jackrabbit dart between the marigolds, its ears catching the light like tiny antennae. "This was always mine," she said quietly, to the wind, to the rabbit, to the stubborn soil that refused to forget her. Across town, in her email inbox, a notification blinked from her bank. Statement available. She didn't open it right away. But later, when the sun was higher and the shadows had drawn sharp lines across the lot, she scrolled through it on her phone. Her balance glowed steady, the interest from her trust. Small but certain. Enough. Secure. Private. No mortgage. No shared name. No debt owed. Not financial, not emotional. She locked the phone, slid it into her pocket, and breathed out. That afternoon, Elijah stopped by one last time. He stood at the edge of the lot, shoes coated in dust, tie loosened against the heat. "I filed the legacy folder this morning," he said. "Everything's in order. The county clerk's office has the trust copies, and Emily's beneficiary notice is sealed until she turns 25. Pat nodded. "You've done good work for me, Elijah." He smiled. "You made it easy. Most clients want to take things with them. You just wanted to leave them clean." "That's the trick," Pat said, pouring him a cup of tea from her thermos. "Know what to keep. Know what to let the desert have." He took the cup, still looking faintly puzzled at her calm. "I'll miss these visits," he admitted. "I imagine you will," she said, smiling, and that was that. When he left, the world folded back into stillness. Char texted an hour later. "Lunch tomorrow? I'll bring the good gossip." Pat replied, "Make it breakfast. Morning's the only time the desert tells the truth." She set the phone aside and leaned back on the bench, eyes half closed against the sunlight. The wind moved softly through the wildflowers, the petals flickering like tiny lanterns. The lot had become something between a memory and a sanctuary. Quiet, humble, unclaimed by ambition. Emily would come tomorrow, probably with another sketchbook. Maybe with her mother trailing reluctantly behind. Pat didn't need to imagine what that scene might look like. It didn't matter anymore. Some stories finish themselves when you stop trying to fix them. She reached down, running her fingertips through the dirt beside her feet. It was warm and alive, crumbling easily between her fingers. The smallest roots coiled under the surface, reaching out in every direction, patient and invisible. She whispered, almost to herself, "You held me long before I knew how to stand on you." A hawk circled overhead, its shadow slipping silently across the field. Pat took another sip of her tea, then folded the drawing and tucked it into her bag. She would frame it later, hang it above her desk next to the rock she'd kept, the one that had survived the demolition. The afternoon deepened. The air shimmered. And for a fleeting second, she felt time pause, like the world was bowing back to her, grateful that she'd learned how to listen. The land was quiet now. The house was long gone. The peace was permanent. She smiled, the kind of small, complete smile that needs no witness. Because in the end, everything had bloomed exactly as it should have. From silence, from loss, from a woman who remembered where she stood. Pat took one last sip, closed her thermos, and whispered the line she'd waited her whole life to say. Not bitter, not boastful, just true. My daughter said, "That's not your spot." So I sold the spot she lives in. The wind carried it across the field like a blessing, and somewhere in the distance, the desert answered with nothing but light.